All right, good evening again. A little revision from last week, a quick few-minute revision, and then we'll go on where we left off. So when we began, we started to look at the Zohar and its analysis of the 4 letters of God's name, which we're now pronouncing as Havaya. And we notice it's got 2 Heis in it. And the whole notion of a Hei is from the word teshuvah, which ends in a Hei, to toshuv Hei. Bring the Hei back to where it should exist. The distortion in the world, which is the distortion that we make when we are inadequate in the way that we behave and do things in the world. When we don't do the mitzvah, we do the opposite of mitzvah, which is called an aveira. The word aveira comes from the word la'avor. It means crossing to the other side. And when we cross to the other side, we distort the letters Hey from their position of God's name. The world is perfectly poised and intact when both Heys are in position. And when we do something incorrect, we nudge the Hey out of position. Now in the month of Elul, when we come back to our normal selves, consciously and intentionally, we bring the Hey back into its normal positioning. That was the first aspect that we spoke about last week. And that made the Yud and the Hei and the Vav and the Hei work well. And we refer to it as Havaya as such. We notice there are 2 Heis, and therefore there's higher level and lower level of correcting, making things correct. Easy things, lower level of teshuvah achieves that. More severe or problematic aspects of our life, to correct them, we need to be able to move to moving the higher level of teshuvah and bringing that Hei into its stark relief. But nothing stands in the way of teshuvah as such. Okay. Now, we looked at the Chumash, and we looked at the Chumash where the Pasuk said, Ki chelek Hashem amoi, that Hashem and his people are joined, that in fact we are part of the Yud Kei Vav Kei, and what we're saying then is what we do counts. That's another way of saying what we do counts. It affects the cosmos, it affects the world, it affects Hashem as such. Of course, ultimately nothing affects Hashem. Hashem is beyond any effect as such, but nevertheless the way that we talk about it, about creating the kind of equanimity in the world that Hashem desires, is by moving the Hey out of position. The metaphor that's used in the Chumash to describe our relationship to God is the metaphor of breath. It says, and God breathed the breath of life into Adam, vayipach ba'apav nishmas chaim. Hashem breathed into the nostrils, but it's more than breathed, blew. And we said the difference between blowing and breathing, in fact, is that when we breathe, we breathe all day. We breathe constantly. That doesn't tire us out. And yet, a slight change of breath form, blowing, almost immediately creates huge changes in the human being, to the point of even fainting and being unconscious. If you continue to breathe, blow balloons up, and you do it too quickly and too aggressively, then you end up, unfortunately, fainting. Then there was a second analogy that we used, our relationship. Not just God breathed existence and humanity as such, but blew into the nostrils of Adam. Then there's this analogy of speech. God spoke, Vayomer Elokim, God said, let there be this, let there be that, etc. But in speaking, there is much lesser use of breath work than there is in blowing. Blowing forcefully causes the soul's animating force to be used up very quickly. Breathing naturally doesn't. So apply it to God. If God blew into the nostrils of Adam, it means something terribly forceful from God's inner self was taking place in that aspect of creation. It's a much more profound creation, the creation of Adam, than in terms of the other aspects of creation. So we spoke about the inner and outer. when God speaks, there's minimal breath used, and the letter components become channels for creative force. And yes, things are created from God's speech, because there were all the 6 days of creations. And even spiritual entities come from God's speech. But if we're talking about animating something in a much more quantum leap beyond that, maximal creative force, then we use the analogy of blowing. And that was the case of Vayipach as opposed to Vayomer. Not Vayomer Elokim, Vayipach, Hashem blew forcefully. So they're just analogies to end up saying that the creation of Adam Harishon was, in many, many ways, very, very profound as such. Which brings us today. Today we're going to apply this in... Yes, please do, Jack.
Nothing affects God, and
Ultimately.
If a man makes an Aveira, does that affect God?
Depends on what level of our discussion. God, by definition, is totally beyond anything that we can imagine as being an expression of God's creation. In other words, you might even say that the highest forms of angels mean absolutely nothing. The Tanya gives the following example. What is the number 1 in context of billions? If you have 1 and a billion, is there a relationship between 1 and a billion? The answer is yes. 1 is an element of a billion, even of a trillion. But the relationship of God and creation is even beyond that. It's where 1 doesn't even count, a billion doesn't count. There's no relationship whatsoever. So the question is, why does God care what his creatures do? Which is really your question as such. And the short answer is God chose to care. That's the only way we can begin to say. Why is it that you choose to like oranges more than apples, if it so happens to be the case? Why do you have a taste for oranges more than apples?
Just go a bit further. Like when the Israelites in the 40 years rebelled against God's commandments, he punished them.
Absolutely, I'm coming to your answer. In other words, the point being, why is it that we choose something? Why do we choose something? Is there rationality to choosing something? Sometimes, yes. You say, I choose because. But are there things in your life that you choose where there's no because? Yes. Absolutely. There are. If you analyze your life, there'll be choices you make for no logical reason. You come to a fork in the road. You haven't got any idea whether you should take the left fork or the right fork. There's no logic one way or the other. And you go in one of the two. No logic. You do. Likewise with God. That's the way we can speak about it. God chose to make certain things of creation significant. God chose, like the fork in the road, that mitzvot by Jewish people is significant, and Aveirot is also significant. But as an act of choice beyond human concept of logic, as such. So, yes?
I have a question. Does that mirror, are we mirroring in a very respectful way, Hashem's choice? He gave us choice.
Yes, we are. We've been created in the image of God. Therefore, many aspects of the human being mirror, your word is correct, mirror aspects of godliness as such. We are God-like creatures, much more so than a stone is, much more than a flower is, and much more than an animal is. So yes, the fact that we've been given exercise of choice is ultimately God's greatest gift to the human being as such. And the exercise of choice, therefore, has to be one of the most significant aspects of our life. What we're going to speak about today is the relationship of Havaya, Hashem's name, and the sefirot, and how creation mechanically takes place all the time. So, firstly, let's be aware that there are the various names that we attribute to God. One of the names is the one that we were using, Yud and Hei and a Vav and a Hei. Then there's another word, Elokim, right? Which is, we also translate as God. And they're two different aspects of God. And different names of God describe different facilities that God uses in the creation of the world, or the ongoing creation of the world. We should be aware, we should say parenthetically, that Hashem continuously creates the world. It's not that Hashem created the world 5,779.9 years ago and then went off to play Scrabble while he left the human beings to their designs. No, Hashem is consistently involved in every aspect. The blade of grass doesn't grow without Hashem's active involvement in that blade of grass as such. Now, different aspects of godliness produce different aspects of creation. So, souls of angels are rooted in the name of Elokim, whereas souls of man are rooted in the name Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, Havaya. Now, there are also aspects of creation, mechanical aspects of creation, that stem from these two possible sources. Sefirot, which we're going to have to look at more closely, what does that word mean? And we're going to talk about that, are actually rooted in the very high source of Havaya, Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. That's very, very interesting. So if we look at the Yud-Kei Vav-Kei again, the first letter, Yud, has within it the first of the 10 sefirot. What are sefirot? Sefirot are different attributes of Hashem that animate the world. Ultimately, let's jump the gun and go to where Audrey was talking about, the human being as such being the image of God. If you want to have the understanding of how the sefirot operate, you can look at the way that the soul operates within the body. The soul's operation in the body is, if you will, an analog of God's operation in the cosmos at large. Not perfectly, but sufficiently for our discursive purposes. So let's look at the way that the neshama operates within the body. So we know that we are told by the teachers of Kabbalah and Chassidut that in fact there are 10 specific ways in which Hashem constantly animates the world, which are paralleled by the 10 ways in which the soul animates the body. And they have names. We're not going to deal so much with the names, but we're going to look at them individually one by one. The first aspect of any human endeavor is consciousness. Without consciousness, you can't get to square one, okay? What is the source of consciousness? Where does it come from? As I said in my previous session, it comes from subconsciousness. It comes into consciousness, which is just a play of words. But we know that to unfold from nothing into something is fantastic. To come from nowhere and become something is absolutely fantastic, and no human being has ever achieved it. Have you ever created something out of nothing? You might think you do. Have you not created something out of nothing?
Yeah. So I have to think what it is.
Well, the closest thing that I could think of is often the answer is life. But that's not really from nothing, is it?
Right.
That's the closest thing that I...
Yeah. What about the great composers and artists? Are they not creating something out of nothing? So from our point of view that we're discussing, the answer is no. They only create something out of something. A sculptor can take clay and form it into a beautiful piece of art, right? A painter can take the colors and create a beautiful, but it's always something out of something, okay? Only God creates something out of nothing. So the small letter Yud means the small subconscious step of bringing from nothing into something. And the letter Yud represents, therefore, the sefirot of Chokhmah. And Chokhmah is the first step of creation, as we shall see. But all the 10 sefirot that we're going to talk about can be discussed in context of these 4 letters and explaining how they operate mechanically, which I'm going to show you now as we go along for this session.
Doesn't sefirot mean books?
No, a sefirot doesn't mean books. Sfarim is books, yes. The word, you raise a very good point, Jack. The word, the shores of Samech Fei Resh can mean many, many different things. Can you think of different words that those 3 letters conjugate into? Story, Sipur, comes from the same 3 letters. Sofer, a scribe, comes from those 3 letters. I'll give you a cute one. Sapar, a barber, comes from those 3 letters. Now in Hebrew, whenever you have the same 3 letters, that means there's a connection. But we're not going to spend time today trying to relate the connection between a story and a barber. Maybe because barbers tell tall stories, but I'm not sure whether that's the connection we want to make. Anyway, the 10 sefirot are rooted in the letters of Yud Kei Vav Kei. The first letter Yud, as we said, is a unique point, the sefirot of Chokhmah. Chokhmah is the state of concealment with potential of surfacing, something out of nothing. It's got the potential of being able to be there. And the truth of the matter is, even the letter Yud, small as it is, does already have some dimension, reality. So we even go more fine, and we talk about the point that begins the letter Yud, called the okuts, the thorn of the Yud. If you notice the Yud in the Torah, the way that it's shaped, it begins with a little thorn above the letter itself. Have a look at the Yud that we've got here on screen, and you will see that right there's a little thorn right at the top there, right? That's the beginning of movement of subconsciousness into consciousness, albeit that it's very small. It's the beginnings of the idea. It's even not completely shaped. It doesn't have full dimensions of the Hei, and the Yud is small because it's the beginning point, but it even begins from a little thorn as such. And therefore, Chokhmah, the first sefirah of both creation and human consciousness, if we want to apply it to human consciousness, begins with this letter Yud and the thorn that begins the letter Yud as such. So that's the first letter that we're discussing. However, what happens with an idea? What happens with a beginning of a thought? You have an inspiration. It hasn't got shape yet, but it's a beginning of an inspired notion, and then you have to tease it out into a complete shape. So the second letter, the letter Hei, has got much greater dimension than the first letter Yud. So the Chokhmah becomes expressed in reality in terms of the operation of the second sefirah of Bina, which gives it shape. And an analogy, you have an inspired moment, and then you spend time teasing it out into an idea, into a concept. That's the Yud, the inspired moment, and the Hei, the development of an idea as such. That's what the second letter is. That's why the second letter's got a totality of breadth and width, etc., etc., whereas the Yud is merely a point source. So the relationship of the first 2 letters, Yud and a Hei, is the relationship of beginnings and development. Okay?
You could say it was incomplete because it has a space. You could.
Oh yeah, we can play plenty of games with the shapes of the letters, and you're quite right. We've got each a democratic right to interpret the way we choose. However, we're going to look at the way that those who actually knew the inside of aspects of God's mind, so to speak, the Kabbalists interpreted as such. So we're following their line of thought, and later on we can play with our own thoughts as well. Okay, so that's the Yud and the Hei. We've already covered 2 of the 10 sefirot, and we've already covered half of God's name. And we've got 8 to go. So let's have a look how that's going to work. All right, so you've got the Yud and the Hei. Then we're talking about the middle letter. The middle letter, the Vav. Okay? The Vav is a bit of an elongated Yud, is it not? Right? It's got more in keeping with that than it has with that. On the other hand, the Vav, is included in the Hei also to some extent, is it not? Whereas the letter Yud finds itself in every letter of the Hebrew alphabet. What does it mean that the Yud is in every letter of the alphabet? It means that whenever we think, whenever we speak, whenever we do, the original inspired moment must exist. It becomes submerged. We're not aware of the original inspiration, but it must operate in order to give life of all the subsequent developments and evolutions. Otherwise, you stop midpoint. An example that I often give is, right, you're in the kitchen and you have a thought, I must go and get this thing which I need for my recipe, whatever might be the case. And you walk into the dining room and then you stop. Why? Because you've forgotten what it was that you meant to get. Has it ever happened to you? Sounds familiar. What happened was, we had the Yud, we had the Hei, but then we lost the Yud. So the Hei can't exist anymore. So we stopped still. It's like the robot that's been turned off and it stops mid-pose, okay? So what do we do next? You go back to the kitchen and say, now I remember, and you go back and do it. You regain the letter Yud, because the Yud needs to animate all of it. The inspiration has to be in everything, constantly. The soul must be there in context of thought, speech, and behavior. That's an interesting thing. Yes, Laurie?
Point, the Hei, we've talked about looking like you, except it's got a line coming down.
Yes.
The Hei, in my mind, looks like you, extended out at the top with a line.
It looks like it's an expansion of the Yud, a projection of the Yud in dimensions. Very, very good, which it is. Nothing can exist without the Yud. Nothing can exist without the first impetus of godly creative activity. But that godly creative activity expands and becomes a world. We're going to learn that the first Hei is the spiritual world. It's not yet a finite physical world. But even the spiritual world has shape and form and its kind of life. I can't tell you what the angels have for breakfast and the like, but the angels have a life. Have a life. Yeah, even angels get a life as such, whatever that is. We can't begin to understand what that might be all about. But that's still an expansion of the letter Yud. But the letter Vav means that there's a further process. Hashem's intention wasn't to create a spiritual world. The spiritual world was just an ongoing process leading to something further. And therefore the letter Vav is shaped like drawing something down. We're drawing it down. We're contracting all this, the Yud and the Hei, and we're drawing it down to another dimension. And that means it's the drawing down of the other sefirot into the world as such. And we're going to see what they might well be, because they then become the sefirot of Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, and Yesod. Let me go back, because we seem to have lost one of the sefirot. We said Chochmah and Bina. We didn't speak about that, right? Good observation. We spoke at Chochmah, the initial creative force out of nothing, the letter Yud. Hei, the development of it, Bina. So Chochmah and Bina And we sort of then said, oh yeah, and the Vav takes the 6 further sefirot down into another dimension which we haven't yet discussed and we will discuss. What about Da'at? So it's interesting when you study the sefirot of Kabbalah, sometimes you use the word Da'at, sometimes you use the word Keter. Keter comes before Chokhmah, and Da'at comes after. I'm not going to complicate our discussion with an understanding when we use either or. Da'at means Chokhmah and Bina moving towards a goal, a trajectory. In other words, Chokhmah, creative, Bina, developmental, but where does it head towards? What brings these two together in a merger that allows it to become something purposeful? So the Da'at level brings the two together towards a goal, whatever that might be. But it's yet inchoate, it's not fully formed yet, because the ultimate goal is going to be at the end of the final letter Hei. Vav draws it down. Okay, so now we've got to talk about what it is that it draws down. And where does it go to? So if the Vav means the drawing down of Chokhmah and Bina in your own life, the mind life of inspiration, which is the Yud, and then the development of that inspiration, which is Hei, what comes next usually? What makes you move it into the reality of the world?
The action.
But even to act, good, action brings it there. But what gives you the capacity to move, to act?
You've got to bring it together into an understanding or a conclusion from which you can then
Good.
decide how.
Good, so Da'at concludes it, very good. But what makes your body then move? Right, I've now got clarity in my mind. I'm clear what it is that I should do. What makes you say? What makes you do? The intention gives it its direction, but you can have intention in your mind passively without moving your body yet. What makes you move your body? The willpower, okay, but even strong willpower will not fuel the body. What fuels the body? Come on. Feelings. Feelings are the fuel. Emotions. Unless you feel strongly enough, you'll still remain immobile. You know, I really would like to have that ice cream. It's 20:30.
Thank you.
I'm a ventriloquist. So I want to have that ice cream, but you know what? I don't feel strongly enough to get up out of bed and get it. I feel lazy. You've got to have strong emotive power. People don't want to get out of bed in the morning. They have all the best intentions of what they want to achieve during the course of the day, but they haven't got at that moment sufficient emotive power to do it. Emotion is the fuel. Well, the word motivation is a big word. Motivation is already a mixture of all those things in one. I'm trying to break it down into its component parts.
How do you name feelings without thought?
What do we call them? You want to know the word?
You said feelings get you to act.
Yes.
How do you name the feelings, or do you not need to name the feelings in order to get to action?
Yes. The feelings are what the letter Vav draws down. They are the 6 sefirot of Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferet, Netzah, Hod, Yesod. They're the 6 emotive attributes. Now, we can't call them necessarily the 6 emotions, because in English the word emotion doesn't really mean the same as the word midah. We call these midos of Hebrew. It's one step removed, midos. Midos are the spiritual aptitude that produce the emotions. Okay? It's something more subtle than emotion. Emotion is already what you feel, the consciousness of the feeling. When we talk about the 6 attributes, we talk about the 6 doorways from which they come from, which they will step through. But to all intents and purposes, let's call them the emotions. We can talk about them like that also. So we have 6 basic emotions, There's really 7. We're going to come to the 7th as a grand finale. But let's talk about the 6 that are drawn down. They're drawn down from their potential state implicit within the mind. All feelings are located initially within the mind. And they're within Da'at. That third one that we didn't yet tease out, all I said was it would provide a goal for it, etc. But within Da'at is latently all emotions, which become teased out as emotions as such. Now, this is an important concept. We know that mind and emotion are 2 separate pathways, seemingly separate pathways of human consciousness. You can distinguish a feeling from a thought. It's not easy to understand what a thought is, not easy to understand what a feeling is. But we know that they're different, right? You know your feelings are different than your thoughts as such, okay? The 2 are separate. In Hasidus, we learn that all feelings are originally embryonically located within the mind. And from the mind, they flow out to become emotions as such. That is why if you focus and concentrate on a concept or an idea, you awaken feelings for it. If you're not deeply involved with an idea, you won't have feelings for it. You have strong feelings because of a strong mind connection. Okay? All right, so the Hei draws it down. Now, what happens after it's drawn down? It becomes reorganized as an analog of the spiritual Hei into a finite physical shape, which has got length and breadth. The final Hei means that the spiritual antecedent has now become expressed in a finite physical form. Hei represents Hashem's ultimate goal of having a world which Hashem is the God of that world. Sovereign in the old-fashioned English, a sovereign of the world. This state of sovereignty is called Malchut, the 7th of the Midot. Except that Malchut isn't active. Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, Yesod are active. Just very quickly, Chesed is the feeling and attribute of expansion, giving, sharing. Kindness is an example of it. Gevurah is retention, holding within, etc. In other words, limiting the flow of emotion. You've got equal and opposite tendencies. We have both. And therefore, Hashem gives us the third one, Tiferet, which allows the balance of the 2 so you have a feeling that's appropriate to the moment. Remember, the mother hears the child say, give me, give me, give me. The mother says, no, I'm not going to give the child. I'm constantly giving and will spoil the child by giving. And therefore, the Gevurah impinges on the Chesed. And through Tiferet, it becomes a balance in the moment. But that's here, that's within, that's my emotion. How do I bring it out into the world? Now I've got to express it into the world. A parent wants to teach a child. So what does a parent do? Say it's a father and son, for the sake of argument. Father's teaching the son, and the father is sharing the information. But if the father shares all the information, it'll confuse the child. Therefore, what does the father do? Limits the information to the level that the child can take it in. Okay? So there's a balance. Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferet. I want to give everything to my child. I can't do it in the moment because that would hurt the child. I hold back into an appropriate balance. Okay? But that's in my mind before I open my mouth and speak. I now have worked out in my mind what I'm going to tell my child. I'm not going to say all that. I'm going to say just this much because that's appropriate. That's inside me. Now, how do I teach my child? I have to open my mouth. I have to speak. I have to do physical things of sound. I might even allow my body to become animated in the process. Netzach, which is the 4th of the attributes, is that first step. I'm now crossing the interpersonal boundary. I'm moving from me to you, not just in my mind the way I've organized it, Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferet. Now I'm moving out of myself into you, and I'm sharing with you. Netzach is the way that I am determined to get the information across. But then I can be so determined that I can frighten you away. I can frighten the very birds that I want to feed by being too aggressive in the way I approach the birds. So even that determination, that wish to cross the interpersonal boundary, give you the information, I have to hold back. Holding back. Parallel to the internal emotive, you have the external emotive holding back. Hod. So that in fact not everything gets moved across. But that has to be balanced also. And that becomes balanced by the sixth one, Yesod. Yesod balances the two, and the word Yesod in this context and Kabbalistically means in America they call it a faucet, and we call it a tap. So all the Americans who are watching this particular session, I had to translate tap into faucet for them. Okay? So, what is a tap? The tap takes all these things, my internal emotive attributes of Chesed, Gevurah, and Tiferet, and the way I've externalized it into Netzach, Hod, and through Yesod I pour. I get the information across to you. Yesod is more. Yesod also means the bonding. How do I bond with you? How do you bond with me? It's an intangible, how we create a bonding, say, in a classroom setting. Part of that is the use of my voice. Part of that is the use of my body. Part of that is something that you read inside of me, how much I believe what I'm teaching. All that becomes part of the unifying bonding mechanism that's employed to bring us closer together. The closer we are together, the more the information sinks in, the more the information flows. That's part of Yesod. And then you have the final step, the final Hei, Malchut. What is that? That's a container. The tap, the faucet, pours all this into a passive container. This world is the passive container. The finite physical world is the container for all of Hashem's animations of the sefirot of mind and emotion that we call in the human anthropomorphic language. It becomes world. The container as such. And that's what the final Hei is. The final Hei is the state of expanded spirituality in a finite physical form, so that everything within there, the first three letters, is found in there. So you can see how God's name, Yud Kei Vav Kei, the Havaya, has within it the whole process of creation and ongoing creation, down to exactly where we are right here in the world as such. And the analog is this world. I've been giving you the analog in the way that I've been framing this discussion. I said that Chokhmah is the inspiration. I said Bina is understanding. And I said that Da'at focuses it down into the 6 midot. The letter Vav draws them down, and I've been telling you that ultimately it leads to the world as such, the world of Torah and mitzvahs, and the deed. That's the state of Malchut, the final state of Hei. Isn't that fascinating? It really is quite amazing. And it's likewise why we began talking about breath. The final letter Hei is symbolized by breath. Because what's the source of speech? Breath, which is the letter Hei. The letter Hei is the letter of breath. And how do you form breath? By the 5 parts of the body, which create the formation of breath through sound into expression. What is a soundless Hei becomes a finite sound of world. When you use the teeth, the tongue, the lips, the palate, and the throat, the voice becomes expressed. And that means the reality of the world as such comes into being. And this produces the 5 parts of the mouth, creating the 5 sounds, create 5 sets of letters. Some letters are lip letters. Some letters are throat letters. Some letters are what are lip letters? Pei. Mem. So what are teeth letters? Tet, T, the sound T itself. Okay. What is a throat letter? Reish. Chaf. Okay. Anyway, you've got 5 sets of letters that are products of these 5 different sources of formation of sound. So, for example, the Beit, Vav, Mem, and Pei through the lips, the Aleph, Chet, Hei, Ayin through the throat, etc., and onwards. And therefore, Hebrew grammar, which some people studied back in the early grades of Hebrew school as such, we don't realize, because they don't study spirituality, that the Hebrew grammar comes from the sources of the parts of the mouth that modulate breath and creating sound. And that's why it all begins with breath as such. It's quite amazing. Yes. When we go to school and we learn rules of grammar of the 5 different parts, 5 different sets of rules for 5 different sets of letters, what they don't realize is that what we're really doing is talking about why these 5 sets of letters are 5 sets of letters, because they are the product of the way that the breath is modulated through impinging on the vocal cords and shaped by the 5 parts of the mouth that create those sounds. And therefore there's families of letters depending on which part of the orifice of the mouth is dominant in shaping that sound. Okay, now let's go back to the origin of the discussion, teshuvah. When we do something right, when we correct the wrong, we're returning the letter Hei to its rightful place in the name of Havaya. That's what we do through the act of teshuvah. We're restoring God's name, the Kabbalists describe to us. And if we do profound teshuvah, then we're restoring the first letter Hei. Simple teshuvah, the latter letter Hei as such. And that's why now we happen to be in the month of Elul as we speak. The month of Elul is the month where we actually focus more intensely on this process of rebuilding Hashem's kingdom, to use an antiquated model, that letter Hei, or to put it more contemporary terms, what we're doing is we're rebuilding the normalcy of the world. Why mitzvot do that is God's choice. Why certain actions are desirable by certain soul systems, and we happen to know what the Jewish soul system has to do because they happen to be 613 mitzvot. A non-Jewish soul system doesn't have to do that. They have different sets of mitzvot, so to speak. The 7 mitzvahs b'nei Noach is common to all the 7 mitzvahs of Noah, is common to all the soul systems as such. But that's what we do during the month of Elul. There's a wonderful, beautiful allegory that's described about the month of Elul. It's the month when the king goes out of his palace into the field. Once a year, the king inspects his fields. Once a year, he goes on a carriage on a tour of all these fields to check out what's been happening and the like. Here's the irony of it. When the king is in the palace, we can't get access to the king. Very hard. You've got to go through various checkpoints. You've got to get through various gatekeepers. You've got to be able to circumvent all the preventative measures of officialdom as such. Very tough, very tough. And yet that's when the king is royal, regal, dressed in royal clothing, and all the courtiers and all the awe of the occasion is there. When the king's out in the field, he's in a carriage, he's wearing an overcoat, he hasn't got his crown on, and he doesn't look terribly different than you and I, but we have more access to him. Everyone can walk up to the carriage and say, "Hi, King." That's amazing. So in Elul, this month, the king is in the field, inspecting his fields. Now, We don't recognize him as easily, but on the other hand, he's much more approachable and accessible. So in the month of Elul, we really watch our P's and Q's. We really try to do things well. We really try to carry out the act of teshuvah and return to a state of normalcy, because Hashem is more present. The king is in the field. There's more accessibility to God during the month of Elul. By the time Tishrei comes, he's back in the palace. And then we have to go to shul, and we have to daven, and we have to go through the processes, and we have to try to get past the gatekeepers, which are our own inhibitions and our own problems that we create for ourselves before we... Right now, it's easy, so take advantage of every day now, because really right now, the king is in the field, and you can really do teshuvah in a very, very real way. So by way of summary, Hashem chose, remember we use the word choice, choice doesn't have any logic. Hashem, in his humility, chose the Jewish people to be co-creators of an unfinished universe through the Tariag mitzvot, through the 613 mitzvot. We were chosen to do these mitzvot. Other souls were chosen to do other mitzvot. But that's what we were chosen for. Our task is to carry out the instructions of the builder's manual, right? The Torah. It's a manual. How do you do it? How do you build this building called world? All right. So the manual says, step 1, do this. Step 2, do that, etc. It's our manual, how to carry it out. And when we do succeed in carrying it out correctly and correct our mistakes, then we take the letter Hei and return it to its rightful place in the name Havaya. And this has a multiplier effect. As we succeed to get all the Heis lined up in place, that carries out from the physical world into the spiritual world, right up to God through the sefirot. The sefirot are the messengers that message right up from what we do, right up to the very, very source of everything. And therefore we help create the greatest enterprise that was ever brought into being, the creation of the world.
But I ask you, Ben, what is the difference between the unfinished universe and the creation of the world?
That the world is not fully created yet. In other words, it's an unfinished symphony. Hashem chose us to be partners in an ongoing endeavor. Sure, Hashem could have finished the process in a split second, but whatever reason, Hashem chose humanity to be partners in that endeavor towards a goal. We haven't reached that goal yet.
How will we know when it's finished?
Well, in the manual, it tells us the steps along the way. And one of the most significant steps is the Messianic period. And when Mashiach comes, that becomes a very significant part of the ending point. It's not the very end, but it tells us we're getting close to the end. And since we're told that Mashiach has to come by the end of the 6th millennium, right? And that's the year 6000. And we are in the year 5779, soon to become 80 in a week and a half, okay? That means we are in the Friday afternoon of the week of creation, if you want to look at it that way. We're in the last step, just before Shabbos comes in, before the 7th millennium as such. So we're getting very, very close, except that we can accelerate. It doesn't have to wait for the 6,000th year. If we get our ducks all lined up in a proper line, in other words, if we do the proper teshuvah, we can accelerate the process and Mashiach can be here by the morning. And it only takes one more person to do one more mitzvah for Mashiach to come. We don't know who that person is and what that mitzvah is, so we all keep trying. So I want to wish you a lot of success in ensuring that it's you that we're waiting for and that you complete the task for us. Any other questions?
That's a lovely way to finish off.
Isn't it? So, it's really interesting because I often wonder, people who don't study the deeper spiritual implications of Torah has such a limited vantage point on what life is and what their motivation is, etc. Without the spiritual dimension, it's a fairly dry do's and don'ts. It lacks a certain life. It's like a body without life as such. Of course, you have to maintain the body, but if you can create a sense of meaning and depth, you can carry it out with so much more joy, so much more what we call hitlahavut, animation. Yes, the shoresh of hitlahavut is lahav, a flame. Lahava. Mm-hmm. Okay, all right. I wish you a Shana Tova, a lovely new year. Hope to see you. See you next year. With more, always more.